Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Allison McManus. I'm the Managing Director for National Security and International Policy here at the Center for American Progress. As you're joining me this afternoon, the United States is at war. In launching strikes over the weekend on Iran, President Donald Trump did exactly what he said he would not do on the campaign trail. He has dragged the United States into a needless overseas conflict. Israeli strikes over the weekend killed Iran's supreme leader. Let's be clear, there should be no love lost for Khamenei or some of the other IRGC officials. They have the blood of thousands of Iranians, Americans, Israelis, Lebanese, Syrians, and others on their hands. But this new war has no clear end, and it has already come at a massive cost. Iran's retaliatory strikes have killed now 4 American service members. And President Trump has said that he anticipates more service members will be killed in the days and weeks to come. My heart goes out to those families who have lost their loved ones or who have family members who are deployed right now and are in incredibly anxious times. US and Israeli strikes have also cost the lives of many Iranian civilians. Other retaliatory strikes have killed at least 9 Israelis and others. Global energy markets are reeling from the war already, and we could expect to see continued increases as long as this war continues on. Donald Trump is proving once again that he's unfit to be the commander-in-chief of our armed forces. This week, American lawmakers will be casting votes on joint resolutions of disapproval in both the House and Senate. I'm very grateful to have 3 brilliant colleagues here to help us make sense of this solemn moment. Before I turn to them, I just want to mention that this event will be recorded. It will be posted on our website. We welcome questions, and you can ask these questions using the Q&A function, and we hope to get to as many audience questions as possible. To introduce our guests, we have Mr. John Feiner, a distinguished senior fellow at American Progress. Mr. Feiner served as Principal Deputy National Security Advisor under President Biden from 2021 to 2025, among many other prestigious roles in and out of the government. We have Frank Kendall, who is a Senior Fellow at American Progress. From 2021 to 2025, Secretary Kendall served as Secretary of the Air Force, supervising more than 600,000 airmen, guardians, and civilian employees. He retired from the Army Reserves as a lieutenant colonel, and he is also an attorney active in human rights. And then we have Andrew Miller, a senior fellow also here at American Progress, who most recently served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Israeli-Palestinian Affairs from 2022 to 2024, prior to which he served as Senior Policy Advisor to the U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas Greenfield. So Andrew, I'll turn to you first. I gave a rundown of the developments, and obviously things are moving very quickly. I wonder if you can give us a sense of how we arrived here in this moment and how things are playing out on the ground. I know there's many starting points, but perhaps if we take the strikes last year in Operation Midnight Hammer that were supposed to have obliterated some of Iran's nuclear facilities, what has transpired over the last months that brought us to this moment?
Thanks, Allison. To understand where we are, I think at the very least, need to go back to the Obama administration and the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which placed strict limits on Iran's ability to enrich uranium and pursue various nuclear-related research and activities in exchange for sanctions relief. As you'll recall, that agreement, while not perfect, was working. It was succeeding in preventing Iran from accumulating high levels of highly enriched uranium appropriate for making fuel for a nuclear weapon. And President Trump came into office and decided to unilaterally withdraw the United States. And that really set the conditions that led to last summer's 12-day war, when Israel launched attacks on Iran's nuclear programs. or nuclear program, and the Trump administration ultimately decided to join in with B-2 bombers utilizing special bunker busters that were necessary to target one of the facilities that Iran was using at the Fordell plant. And that strike was successful from the standpoint of destroying a number of centrifuges, which are used to enrich uranium. It killed a number of nuclear scientists within Iran. It did damage to the infrastructure, other aspects of the nuclear production process. But it did not eliminate the highly enriched uranium Iran had accumulated since Trump withdrew from the JCPOA. And we still believe that Iran has roughly 900 pounds of HEU enriched to 60%, which is only a week or two away from being enriched to the 90% level, which is weapons grade uranium that is suitable for a weaponized nuclear device. That said, it's important to differentiate between fissile fuel and an actual weapon. So while Iran was 1 to 2 weeks away from having the fuel necessary for such a weapon, they had not, as far as we know, done the necessary research and developed a device for delivering such a weapon. So it wasn't necessarily imminent even then. But what was clear is that that attack and that campaign, which the Trump administration eventually persuaded the Israelis to end, ultimately damaged Iran's ability to enrich uranium. It damaged their nuclear program. It further set back Iran's nuclear ambitions, but it wasn't a solution. It wasn't a long-term answer to the problems that existed. And Trump declared victory, and as you'll recall, he said we obliterated Iran's nuclear program, even though it was clear he hadn't completely eliminated it. There were still people who knew how to do all the processes. They still had at least some material, and even if they eliminated all of the necessary machinery, that could be rebuilt. Nevertheless, for several months, he turned his back to it, and then at the end of December, we started to see these huge historic protests against the Iranian regime, and that caught President Trump's attention. It wasn't a deliberate policy decision. It wasn't well considered. He simply took note that there were these protests, which is not to diminish them. It was a very impressive display of opposition to a brutal, tyrannical regime. People turned out, and the president said, help is on its way. Turn out, express your voices. The USA is with you. And it's clear that at least some Iranians joined those protests, believing that President Trump would intervene in the event that they were attacked. That did not happen, and we know now that thousands of Iranians were killed by the regime as they violently dispersed the protest. The numbers, could be higher, but there are at least 5,000 Iranians believed to have died. And since then, Trump has been focused on Iran. There's some reason to believe that he might have ordered strikes at that time in the mid to the late January period if the pieces were in place for defending the United States assets as well as our partners and allies in the region in expectation of Iran's retaliation, but they weren't. And then that led to this prolonged negotiation over nuclear weapons or over the nuclear program, which had, again, supposedly been obliterated, was not what people were protesting about, but he viewed that as an off-ramp or as some way of demonstrating that he had achieved something. But now that we know where we are, I think there's good reason to, one, question how sincere they were in pursuing those negotiations that entire time. And two, I think we can be completely confident that they do not have a command of those issues. And ultimately, it led up to the decapitation strikes that you referenced against the supreme leader and several senior members. Since then, what we've seen is tactical successes by Israel, by the United States against regime targets. Other leaders have been killed. We've seen strikes on ballistic missiles on IRGC targets. We've also seen impressive defensive efforts against Iranian retaliation. But unlike last summer, we're seeing a different Iranian approach where they're not only primarily going after Israel in retaliation. More munitions have actually been launched at the Gulf states, and not just the U.S. bases in those states, but clearly against civilian targets in those countries as well. And it's caused a great deal of destruction. It's caused a great deal of panic and disruption. And unfortunately, we've had 4 Americans killed. 9 Israelis have been killed. Several people have been killed in the Emirates. We've had some deaths in Kuwait and Bahrain as well. And we've had injuries too. What is significant, though, and I'll close with this, is unlike past Iranian responses to U.S. or Israeli actions, Iran seems to be one, more sophisticated in how it's using its weapons, or they may be using different missiles that are more capable, and they're deploying them differently. Rather than launching mass barrages at one time in the hope of saturating the missile defenses, they are launching them in smaller numbers, but with more of a sense of what they're trying to target. And that's part of the reason that they were able to get through on at least a few occasions and unfortunately kill Americans, kill Israelis, injure other people. And part of this is almost certainly due to the fact that if in the past the Iranian regime had reason to try to calibrate, to tone down its response so that they could strike a balance between showing that they were serious but not provoking the United States or Israel into further action, because this has been defined in existential terms, with both Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump saying that the objective is to get rid of the regime, there is very little reason for the regime to hold back. So if this lasts long enough, at one time or another, I think we need to be prepared for the possibility that they'll use whatever is in their arsenal.
Thanks so much, Andrew. And I think you're highlighting a fundamental tension here in terms of the president's rationale for carrying out military action. And that's one, he says that these will be limited strikes, and obviously has a disinclination for putting boots on the ground. And yet, on the other hand, the objectives that he's outlining, particularly around regime change, it's difficult to see how these will be achieved with a limited air war. And so with that, Secretary Kendall, I'd love to turn to you. How likely do you think it is that this truly is a limited campaign? If Trump is really interested in regime change, how likely is that with boots on the ground? How do you think that the Trump administration might be able to declare that this is a success and wrap up? And would love your thoughts there.
Well, unfortunately, the Trump administration doesn't have complete control of that. And as we're seeing with the reaction from Iran, they do have some things that they can do. Air power has become Donald Trump's preferred tool in these situations. And our military, both the Navy and Air Force, have a lot of capability, but they have some fundamental limitations also. There's only so much you can accomplish with a bombing campaign. And if there was an expectation for some reason that Iran would capitulate immediately the way that Venezuela seems to have, I don't think there was any real basis to assume that. And what we're seeing as the hours go by even is increasing broadening of the conflict in different asymmetrical means from Iran. How long they can keep that up is hard to say. How long we can keep up a strategic bombing campaign is hard to say. And at some point, you start to wonder, what are the targets that are left? Iran's been given a lot of time to prepare for this. They have some high value assets like their nuclear facilities that we were able to strike. We were able to do a leadership decapitation attack. But some of the command and control centers for the military, perhaps, naval assets, which are fairly easily targetable. But Iran can disperse its assets, it can hide them, it can use deception to deceive us about what they are. And it's, as it has shown over the last couple of days, it can mount some counterattacks with its ballistic missiles, which many of which are mobile. So how long this will go on? A lot of that is in the hands of the Iranians. Will there be a popular uprising? I don't know that there's any firm basis to expect that. The Iranian military and the Republican Guards and so on seem to be pretty much in control. And they demonstrated that very convincingly with thousands of people that were killed during the protests. So I don't necessarily see a quick end to this. There are attacks occurring throughout the Middle East now. I think we have basis to think there may be attacks by even lone wolf terrorists out to revenge the death of Khomeini in the United States. So Donald Trump has made a huge gamble here. He did this without congressional authorization. He did it without any UN approval. He did it in isolation, and he's going to own all the consequences, whatever they are. There are a number of fundamental questions, I think, about the constitutionality of this, and so the Congress should step up and assert its role, which it has not done so far. But we may be into a conflict that will go on for some time, and that will extract casualties in the Middle East and even in the United States. We'll see. He's now talking about a few weeks of a strategic bombing, of bombing. Eventually, you're just bombing rubble. And it gets harder and harder to find the targets that you are certain are military targets. And it's more likely that civilians will be killed as time goes on.
Thanks so much, Secretary. And of course, we are here only 3 days into this campaign. And so I think, of course, we will have to see how things play out over the next weeks. John, I'll turn to you. I'd love to get a regional perspective on this. And Andrew mentioned in the past Iran's what he called carefully calibrated response. You were in the Biden administration, at several times when Iran had launched missile attacks toward Israel. And in those instances, there was a great deal of coordination between the United States, Gulf partners, et cetera. This time around, of course, Israel joined the strikes, but GCC countries condemned them, off the bat. Now dynamics are changing as some of those countries are being targeted by Iran. So can you just give us a sense of what are some of the regional dynamics at play here? How have they changed over the past years, and where do you see them headed?
Thanks, Allison. Yeah, I think there's a high degree of paralysis and anxiety in the region right now, and it differs a bit by country. I think you're right that none of the countries in the region were openly supportive of what the United States and Israel have done. There have been these reports that maybe behind the scenes, Saudi Arabia had a different position. I don't know that to be true. Certainly publicly and in my conversations, they said they were not supportive of another war. They're now at least declared that they're going to participate in one way or another. I think the UAE didn't want any part of this and is now paying a significant price. They've benefited tremendously by being seen as a safe, hospitable destination for international business. And now that is all being called into question, which is a significant part of their value proposition as an economy. And so they're suffering for that. The Qataris and Omanis tried to avoid this outcome fairly actively. The Qataris, I think, played a big role in generating the negotiations that I don't think the United States really engaged in good faith in retrospect, but the Qataris were strongly supportive and the Omanis hosted them. And now other countries that really had nothing to do with this are being destabilized by it. As people will have seen, Lebanese Hezbollah has said it's joining now this fight in some way, launching rockets at Israel, which has prompted the Lebanese government basically to tell them to move to Iran, which they're not going to do. So a significant, I think, risk of return to major instability in Lebanon. Further afield, by the way, this gets even more complex or perhaps complex in a different way. I just happen to be in India today, where there's significant concern about the fact that half of, roughly maybe more, of their crude oil comes to them through the Strait of Hormuz, which is now essentially shuttered by the Iranians and by the fighting. And you can hang on for a while in that circumstance, but it's going to get to be a bit of a pinch over time, especially with prices rising and alternative sources of supply not readily available. So, I think there are a number of countries that are now paying the price for this, that didn't want any part of it, had nothing to do with it, and the risk that this is going to spread further is high. The last thing I will say is, I think this has increased the likelihood of proliferation concerns, both in the Middle East and beyond. I mean, there does seem to be a lesson that we are teaching the Iranians and people who are observing them that, if you don't have a nuclear weapon, you are subject to this sort of existential threat to your regime and to your country. And I think there is a concern that countries are going to draw that lesson, and as the United States turns its attention away from our traditional regions of strategic focus, Europe and Asia, I worry about those countries as well going down this path. You saw this announcement today, probably from Emmanuel Macron and the French, that they're going to be extending their nuclear umbrella into other parts of Europe. I don't think that's a pure coincidence that comes amidst a U.S. focus on this conflict, and also obviously amidst the United States turning its back to a large extent on some of our security commitments in Europe, including vis-a-vis Ukraine, but also calling into question our commitments to NATO. So there's a lot going on here that extends certainly to the rest of the Middle East, but also beyond.
And John, if I can just come back to you on that. I mean, you talked about incentives around pursuing nuclear weapons for countries that we may not be parties to this conflict. I'm curious what incentives you think a next Iranian leadership might have to either resume a nuclear program, to actually pursue a nuclear weapon, to enter talks. I recognize that's will require you to do a bit of hypothesizing. We don't really know what succession looks like, but I'd be curious for your thoughts.
Well, look, it's worth reminding people that Iran made a decision as a government, by the way, under the supreme leader's control, and essentially it is his decision not to pursue a nuclear weapon. That's not my opinion. That is U.S. intelligence community's assessment going back to 2002, 2003, and the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And they never really went back on that decision during the intervening years. And so, whether that decision looks wise or foolish in retrospect is going to be something that a lot of people are going to have opinions on, first and foremost, whoever ends up leading Iran coming out of this. But you can see a pretty strong incentive to go down a different path, given where the decision to forego a nuclear weapon and to ultimately negotiate a deal that the United States itself abrogated, where that led. And people who argued for that approach, who argued for not pursuing a nuclear weapon, who argued for negotiations and accommodation with the West have been, well, many of them have been killed, but have also been totally discredited by the turn of events that this administration and the first Trump administration have pursued.
Thanks, John. Andrew, I'll turn it to you. Really just wanted to see if you had anything to add to John's comments. I know that this is something you've written on both for CAP and elsewhere over the past months, and just curious as to how you see both the regional dynamics, but also incentives on whatever the next leadership of Iran looks like.
Right. Thanks, Allison, and very much agree with John's analysis of the situation and the incentives that do exist. But what I think is important to underscore is that moving away from the leadership level, there's a high degree of ambivalence about this throughout the region. There's opposition and ambivalence. Even within Israel, there was polling that came out a few days before Saturday, before the war began, that showed 51% of Israelis, so a slight majority, would only support Israel joining the U.S. and attacking Iran if Israel came under direct attack first, which is not necessarily what you would expect given how single-minded Prime Minister Netanyahu has been about Iran over his entire career, and the role that he's played in highlighting this threat and encouraging action and seeking to cooperate with the United States to take military action to deal with the nuclear challenge posed by Iran. But the Israeli public is actually, many are quite fatigued after the last several years, and they want to get back to something approaching a normal life. And instead of that, they're running to bomb shelters for hours at a time and hoping that they don't suffer a direct hit, because the shelters probably aren't going to withstand that. And in Iran itself, I think it's important to acknowledge that we need to approach our understanding, and it's difficult because of the limited access into Iran, of popular views within Iran, with some nuance, that there isn't a single dominant view within Iran about this. And as one of our colleagues noted, although many Iranians understandably rejoiced at the death of the supreme leader, that does not necessarily translate into support for the United States or support for Israel in this broader war effort. And for many Iranians, they certainly want to see this regime go, but they're not necessarily supportive of the way in which it's being pursued. And if they are, it is revealing of just how bad things are in Iran, that they would support a war in which they would be put in severe jeopardy. In the Gulf, I think they were relatively consistent, as John mentioned, in wanting to avoid association with this campaign. Their economies depend on a degree of stability, and certainly the major players in Riyadh, in Abu Dhabi, in Dubai, and Doha were able to begin to make broader progress beyond the oil industry, beyond the gas industry, by presenting themselves as a stable location to do business, and that has now been challenged. And what's important to recognize is this may not be short term. In trying to understand the trajectory in which this is going to potentially play out, there are going to be different dynamics for different countries, and it's possible that even if the situation in Iran turns out better than I think many of us expect, there is going to be a question mark regarding the stability of or the security in the Gulf states. And at a time when a country like Saudi Arabia is trying to make this enormous transition, when the UAE, its ability to continue to attract investment, to attract businesses is critical. Do they want to have this hanging over their head? But I mean, when you're looking at Iran, and I'll end with this, I think that there are three broad possibilities. One is that Trump more or less walks away, and that another supreme leader is selected, and it's more or less it's the same Iranian regime without Khomeini. So it wouldn't be it wouldn't represent a major change other than what John noted, which is we shouldn't underestimate the role Khomeini played in developing and enforcing Iran's nuclear policy, and that is going to be a question mark, even if the regime largely holds together. I think the second possibility is that we could see absolute chaos. We could see more or less a failed state within Iran if the regime is toppled. It's not abundantly clear that there is an opposition that's capable of uniting together or working with regime elements to maintain cohesion in a country that is diverse, in a country that has cleavages, in a country that has been racked by years of economic neglect. You could see a chaotic environment, and that's not going to be good for anyone. or you could see the IRGC take over. I think those are the most likely, where you would essentially have the Islamic Republic without the clerics, and the Islamic. John and I were discussing this earlier, but I would say that at best you could see a moderate improvement, but I think it's much more likely that you see something that's even worse, that you see an even more belligerent, combative Iran, and an Iran that feels the only way it can protect itself is to develop nuclear weapons. So if there was any doubt regarding the direction in which Iran should move based on what happened last summer, that has, I think, been erased or eroded, because Iran previously could have said, well, that was a one-time development. It was an anomaly. We were attacked, but ultimately we can find other ways of defending our territory. The regime could make that argument. Now that it's happened twice, and there's a very good possibility that, particularly if Trump does end this in the next several days or in the next week or two, that there will be a third intervention. The regime's going to have to reach the conclusion that either we do capitulate, which seems unlikely, or we're going to have to find another way to protect ourselves. And it seems like the way other countries like Iran have been able to do that is through the acquisition of a nuclear weapon. And once that happens, I think if that does happen, it's all but assured that other countries are going to acquire nuclear weapons. And it is noteworthy that, according to reporting in the press, the Trump administration is considering a 1-2-3 agreement with Saudi Arabia that would allow for enrichment, which was the sticking point in these negotiations between the Trump administration and the Iranian regime. So they're sending conflicting signals, and unfortunately, once the first pin falls, the other pins are going to fall automatically. And you could see Turkey, you could see Egypt, you could see any number of countries. And while we fortunately haven't seen a nuclear weapon used in combat in over 80 years now, the more countries that have them, just by virtue of the law of numbers, you're more likely to see something happen.
Thanks, Andrew. Secretary Kendall, I know you've only got a limited time, and I do have one question that I want to pose to you that's a bit broader, zooming out a little bit. It was just a few weeks ago, we were talking about, maybe not even a few weeks ago, a couple weeks ago, we could say, we were talking about the significance of buildup of naval assets around the Caribbean. And now we see the largest buildup in the Middle East since 2003. Of course, we have a lot of sailors who have been on very long deployment. We've seen a lot of weapons that have been used. And I'm just curious as to your take on what this force posturing tells us about the Trump administration's priorities, and what that means, the broader significance there for national security.
I was happy to do that. Let me add a footnote to the excellent comments by Andrew and John. In both Iran and the United States, the calculations and motivations have a lot to do with internal politics, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. For the Trump administration, the midterms are coming up. And Donald Trump is going to want a deal of some kind, and he will probably try to cut a deal with whatever ruling entity emerges in Iran. And in Iran, the existing regime wants to hold on to power one way or the other, and probably will be anxious to cut a deal. So if there's a path out of this that looks like it might be in the interest of both sides, it's something along those lines where Donald Trump gets the claim victory. To your question on the posture and the capability of the military, we have a lot of capability, but we only keep about 4 carriers at sea at a time. The rest are all in training or in some kind of form of maintenance. We put 2 carriers in the Caribbean for a while. That meant we had to bring one from someplace else. We've got 2 carriers in the Middle East now. So the places that don't have that kind of assets are, in particular, the Pacific, where our greatest strategic threat lies. We're consuming munitions. We've got reasonable inventories. We did not draw down significantly our air munitions. We used a lot of ground munitions, artillery and so on, MLRS rockets in Ukraine, and have moved to try to replenish those. So there is ultimately, if this goes on for terribly long, an impact on our munition stockage that'll have to be addressed. We have control of the air in Iran, so we can use relatively short range, relatively still precision, but relatively less sophisticated, less expensive munitions for a lot of the targets we would have to serve. as this goes on, finding, lucrative targets is going to become harder and harder, as I mentioned earlier. But we can keep the pressure on for several weeks, I think. There's no doubt of that. The two carriers are an important part of the force, but there are 5 or 6 Air Force bases, which each of a wing, 70 airplanes roughly for the Air Force in the region. And as long as the host countries allow us to operate from those bases, we can continue operations from there. So I think we have the power to keep this up for quite some time and without a dramatic impact on our posture otherwise. But there is an impact. The Navy in particular has a very tight schedule for carrier deployments, where they are, when they are, and what they're doing at any given point in time. And that's all been disrupted by both of these operations.
Thanks so much, Secretary. And if I have you just for another couple minutes, we did have a question from the audience that I wanted to put to you, which is, given Trump's attacks on and politicization of U.S. intelligence agencies and within U.S. intelligence agencies, how reliable do you think are the assessments now guiding these military decisions?
Unless we have good human in the country, or Israel has it, it's going to be very hard, I think, to get accurate information. The intelligence community is very capable. They can get a lot through communications means, basically. But the Iranians are aware of all those collection means, so they will do everything they can to conceal what they're doing and try to preserve their assets. I think I'm getting the hook. I'm going to have to jump off, Allison. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Secretary. John, we'll turn back over to you now. We've talked a lot about, here at CAP, a lot about the ways that President Trump is using power and the ways in which his application of power is eroding and depleting it. I'm sure there are some that may look at the strikes and see that this looks like successful action. This looks like a successful use of the U.S. military to decapitate a brutal regime. I'm wondering, how you might respond to that. What does this war tell us about U.S. power? And you alluded to it a bit with the way that India might be seeing things, but particularly given this sort of changing world order, the ways in which the Trump administration has undermined partnerships around the world and the way that middle powers are trying to navigate that.
Thanks. Yeah, look, I guess to put it succinctly, what I would say is, at a time in which Russia is continuing to wage an existential war against Ukraine, and in which China continues to pose, as Frank Kendall just said, the greatest strategic threat to the United States, we have an administration that is choosing to double down on the use of force in the Caribbean, where there is no meaningful imminent threat to the United States, and in the Middle East, where Iran is a nasty, horrific regime that also does not pose an imminent threat to the United States, and more or less backing away from our commitments to our NATO allies and to Ukraine. And on the cusp of, I think, making a significant number of concessions to try to make meetings between President Trump and President Xi Jinping look successful from a public relations perspective over the course of this year. There may be as many as 4 of them. That, to me, does not speak of strength. It speaks of accommodating countries that we believe are strong and attacking countries that we think we can get away with attacking without meaningfully advancing our interests.
Thanks, John. Andrew, anything to add?
I mean, as has been discussed before, Trump seems to be enamored of military power, and in particular of air power. And this is part of the danger where we have such an impressive military. We truly have the world's best military, and we can achieve any number of tactical successes, but those successes don't translate into strategic gains. And Trump is the ultimate salesman. He's the ultimate marketer, and he's very effective at taking operations like the one in Venezuela against Maduro. Although it was the Israelis who took the strike that eliminated Khomeini, he will be crowing about the air campaign in Iran. But that's a distraction and diversion from the reality of the balance of power that exists, rather than an elucidation or rather than something that changes it. And there are other costs associated with using force. It's not just that it's expensive. It's not just that it is finite. Just in the way that we try to learn from other wars or from other battles, how countries operate, how weapons can be used. When we're deploying some of our advanced capabilities for the first time in combat situations, that gives China, that gives Russia, that gives other countries an opportunity to observe what we can do and to begin to take actions to potentially preempt or to defeat our capabilities. So the idea that we're just going to blow them away by our brilliance and our competence, and that's going to be enough to deter them. I think they are wowed by what we're able to achieve, but ultimately they're going to sit down and try to figure out how to get around what we do have in the same way that we would. So if anything, engaging in these wars of choice, these adventures, it makes it more difficult to succeed against our actual threats, our actual near peer competitors, or however we want to term it, because we are using limited opportunities. We're using surprises where the surprises aren't necessary. So it really is heedless. It really is reckless and gratuitous. And ultimately, it's not just bad from an academic or from a theoretical perspective. It results in more people coming home in body bags. It results in higher prices for the American public. It's a terrible outcome, and it's going to be important to convey that to the American people so they understand it.
Thank you both. We have another question from the audience, and I know we've sort of touched on this earlier in the conversation, but if the end game here does look like a Trump administration, does look like some sort of regime succession, and that a Trump administration, rather than put boots on the ground, decides to do business with the next Iranian leader. What does that mean for the Iranian opposition? Trump had said just a few weeks ago that he was willing to intervene on their behalf, and Andrew, you mentioned this earlier. Recently had said that this, the government and the country is theirs to take. Sort of what do you see as the trajectory, really, for not just Iranian opposition, but for the many Iranian people who bravely came to the streets just a few weeks ago? Where are they in all this? And Andrew, I can turn back to you, and then John, curious for your thoughts as well.
Unfortunately, I think it's a question of when, not if, Trump abandons the Iranian opposition. Arguably, he already has. At the same time that he's talking about this historic opportunity for Iranians to rise up and overthrow the regime, he's also saying, but I'm willing to talk to the regime. And when asked about who the United States would be willing to work with, he said, well, the people we were considering have been killed. That doesn't instill confidence that he actually cares about the Iranian opposition, and he's going to seek to advance them. That said, even when we have tried to advance opposition in these types of conflicts, we haven't been very successful, but intent does matter here, and Trump is ultimately going to pursue his own selfish interest. It's not going to be about the Iranian people. But on a net basis, if the most likely outcomes are either the IRGC control, a different supreme leader, or chaos, I don't see how the Iranian people are better off than they were under the status quo ante. And that's not to diminish the hardships and the repression they endured. It's just that making things better in the short term is not always a possibility. Sometimes the only other option is moving in the wrong direction, and strategic patience is what's required. But strategy and patience are not exactly the hallmarks of Donald Trump as an individual or the Trump administration as an institution.
John, would love your thoughts here.
Yeah, look, if I were a member of the Iranian opposition, by the way, a group of people I deeply admire, and the physical and moral courage that they showed during those demonstrations is something I think most Americans, I put myself in that category, just cannot possibly imagine. And they deserve just incredible respect for that. But if I were them, I would look at the experience of the Venezuelan opposition, which had extremely high hopes when President Trump went into their country and at some significant risk removed the dictator who was running the show, and now has been perfectly content to deal with that dictator's deputy, who is every bit a part of the dictator's regime. So, you can almost wonder that if there were a popular uprising in Venezuela today against Delcy Rodriguez and the remnants of the Maduro regime, would President Trump be supportive of that, or would he be supportive of the partner who he seems perfectly happy to work with in Delcy Rodriguez? I don't have confidence that he would support a popular uprising in Venezuela. I think more likely than not, he'd say, well, she's working out okay for us, so we should just stick with her. And none of that would give me confidence that the outcome is going to be any different inside Iran. We'll see.
Thanks so much. I mean, really what we're looking at here is a scenario that within, just outside of a year, we've seen major U.S. military deployments, the removal of or killing of heads of state in two countries, the death of service members, death of, many civilians, and what at the end of the day has failed to deliver, any meaningful democracy. And I think, as you both outlined, potentially raises the incentives for a more nuclear armed world, which is, a huge concern and quite a feat, again, in the span of 14 months. Andrew, you laid out a few different scenarios, maybe even what I outlined is a best case scenario, given some of the alternatives, which could be chaos, continued conflict. And of course, we haven't spent a ton of time talking about the actions that Iran's proxies could take, or potential attacks, cyber terrorists, et cetera. What are you? I mean, I'd love to, for our audience to hear, what are you both going to be looking for over the next days and over the next weeks? We haven't talked much about boots on the ground, and again, that's something that, at least for now, Trump seems to be serious about wanting to keep off the table. But what indications would you see that this conflict is moving towards something that's broader regional conflagration, or how things might actually end on the ground in Iran? And Andrew, I'll turn to you first.
Well, I think that it's relatively unlikely that we will see regional escalation in the form of ground warfare across countries. The Lebanon is perhaps the one exception, and obviously, if the Trump administration changes its perspective on Iran, we could have the deployment of troops there. But Iran doesn't really have an expeditionary capacity to invade its neighbors under these circumstances. Israel, without the United States, does not have the ability to land large numbers of the IDF in Iran to conduct operations. They can do special forces, but that's much more limited. Escalation really is in the form of munitions, of missiles, of rockets, where they're coming from, who's firing them, and where they're being fired. So there are still some dominoes that have left the fall. The Houthis have not become involved as of yet, and they do have increasingly sophisticated capabilities. Their ability to harass commercial traffic in the Red Sea and the Mediterranean is already well demonstrated. That has less of an impact economically on the United States, but is hugely disruptive to Europe and to some of our regional partners in the Middle East. That certainly could take place. You could see more activity by Iraqi Shia militias. There is the possibility that Hezbollah, Israel is not going to subside, based on what the Israelis are saying. Now that Hezbollah has joined the fray, it appears that Israel is seeking to kill Nasrallah's successor, Qasem. So it's unclear, whether one, they will succeed in doing so, but two, if they did take him out, would Hezbollah be able to just absorb that one, take it on the nose? They're in a weak position, but at the very least, it would have significant ramifications for what's taking place in Lebanon. And we should take a moment to acknowledge that the ceasefire that was in place, that was not holding perfectly by any stretch of the imagination. The Israelis were conducting daily attacks, but you didn't see large scale exchanges across borders for the better part of a year and 4 months. Now that's out the window, and that is a direct result of launching this war on Iran. There could be ramifications for Syria as well. Although Syria, the regime Shara there is trying to do everything possible to insulate himself and to stay out of this competition. But the regional, the broader regional dynamics are, I think, as John said earlier, very well, are ones of anxiety. They are just hoping for the very best, recognizing that they're not necessarily the major players, are not necessarily the major decision makers. And if we see any indication of U.S. troops, being sent to the Middle East, U.S. soldiers, that could be an indication that something is going to change. If we see expansion of attacks to Iraq or other locations, that could be, again, another indication. It may not be reflective of administration policy. It certainly doesn't help that our ambassador to Israel said, "I wouldn't have a problem if we wouldn't have a problem if Israel took the entire region." And that's something that people in the region have noticed, and it contributes to instability. It contributes to a perception that is unfavorable and a disservice to the United States and Israel both. So that's very much what I'm looking at. I think ultimately it comes down, though, to Trump and the Iranian regime. Is the Iranian regime, is someone going to step forward? Is there any indication of that? Is Trump going to start to get spooked by the markets and decide to call this? It's a bit like Kremlinology. It's hard to say what's going to cause him to move in that direction.
Thanks, Andrew. So, John, I'll turn it to you for the last word, and I realize it's quite late where you are. What will you be looking for over the next days and weeks? And if I may, just because we've had a few questions on this from the audience, how might you see broader regional geopolitical implications? Sort of what's the calculus that Russia, China, or partners and allies in Europe might be making?
So, okay, then in that case, just 3 quick points. The first 2 are competing timelines. One is the timeline of the Trump administration and the Israelis, who are going to seek to do as much damage to this regime as they can for whatever duration this conflict lasts. And they, by the way, may have slightly divergent views of how much damage is enough. I strongly suspect the Israelis are going to want to continue to press this regime until it is meaningfully gone. I'm not sure the Trump administration is as committed to that objective, but that's one timeline. The countervailing timeline that is going to shorten potentially the conflict really, I think, comes down to 2 things. One, market impact, including energy markets, which President Trump has in the past demonstrated some degree of sensitivity toward. He doesn't really pay much attention to members of Congress saying he's doing the wrong thing, or even necessarily to polls, which strongly indicate opposition to killing the supreme leader of Iran, which sort of surprised me. He is sensitive to market factors. And so if there continues to be a pileup of bad market days like the one that's taking place today, I think that will push him in the direction of shortening this. And the other thing that I think will push him in the direction of shortening this is what I and others, I think, sometimes refer to as missile math. how many interceptors, which are the munitions we shoot at missiles and drones to knock them out of the sky, defensive systems, do we have left compared to the number of drones and ballistic missiles that Iran is shooting at the United States and our allies? And I don't know the answer to that question. The administration, I hope, does have a pretty clear sense of the answer to that question. And I also strongly hope they do not allow things to get to the point where Iran has missiles and drones left in their stocks, and we don't have interceptors available to take them out. The war should stop before then. Those are the two key timelines. On your geopolitical question, I'll tell you what I'm worried about, which is the more that we seem distracted in the Caribbean, distracted now in the Middle East, the more that creates potential opportunities for adversaries to take advantage of our distraction, whether that's Russia further pressing what they believe is their advantage in Ukraine, now that the United States is somewhat checked out of that conflict, or China trying something new and consequential in the Indo-Pacific. And I know that we will have people who are paying attention to those things. Certainly our military commanders in those theaters will be. But the total distraction of the administration's political leadership on these problems that were not imminent threats, I worry creates opportunities for our adversaries, and I hope that we're wise to that.
Andrew, John, thank you both so much. I think we are, again, at the beginning of something that's quite fundamental, and I think you've both outlined some serious concerns. We will certainly be watching how this plays out here at the Center for American Progress. We're developing analysis on geopolitical implications. We are looking very closely at the costs that this war will be bringing to not only the country's security, but the actual costs to taxpayers. We're also going to be watching very closely what happens this week, again, as we see votes in both the House and Senate on these joint resolutions of disapproval. So with that, we will let you go. Thanks so much to our audience for joining. You'll be able to find a recording of the event online. Thanks so much, all.